partner Fred for getting me here and working with me this entire season and last season, and together we have obviously achieved success. But I also have to thank our coach, Mr. Lowry, for teaching us the basics of debate and helping us to this point, and also our debate team for supporting us through this tournament and helping us provide evidence against other teams. I also have to thank our opponents here, Joel and Tim, for inspiring us to join debate and for teaching us and guiding us here as well. I have to thank all policy debaters here today for giving us good competition to work against. I'll thank the judges for judging, and most importantly, I have to thank my parents because I wouldn't be here without them. Okay, without further ado, let's begin. Due to the vast amount of factors killing coral reefs, it is impossible to save them through traditional means. However, coral reefs are important to millions of people around the world. Therefore, we affirm the resolution. Result: the United States federal government should substantially increase its non-military exploration and/or development of the Earth's oceans. First, we must address the state of coral reefs. Observation 1 is the state of coral reef decline. Subpoint A. The coral triangle is home to the most coral species, but is at risk now. This is a Financial Times magazine, January 16, 2015. Life on a coral reef is a delicate balance between destruction and creation, a balance under threat as oceans become more acidic. The increased acidity is bad news for coral reefs, as we already know that growth is hampered by acidity as well. It is a worrying thought for the 360 million people living in Southeast Asia's coral triangle. The triangle is home to 76% of the world's coral species. By 2030, virtually all coral reefs in the coral triangle will be threatened by a combination of local human activities, warming, and ocean acidification. Subpoint B. Scientific evidence says the Caribbean corals are dying rapidly. This is Chris Mooney, February 3rd, 2015. A scientific report on the corals in the Caribbean Sea found that corals declined from 34% to 16%. The chief threat to the corals is climate change. Climate change provides a double blow to corals because it also brings on ocean acidification driven by increasing concentrations of carbon dioxide. As seawaters acidify, corals have a harder time producing calcium carbonate, which is crucial to reformation. These problems are currently not being addressed in the status quo, shown in contention to inherency. Subpoint A. U.S. fails at protecting coral reefs because they ignore emerging technology. This is Issues in Science and Technology, Winter 2004. The U.S. government is fully aware of the value of these marine ecosystems and the fact that they are in trouble. In 1998, Clinton established the U.S. Coral Reefs Task Force. Yet, however well-intentioned this move on part of the government, coral reef health has continued to decline, and the U.S. Coral Reefs Task Force has not been able to stem the degradation. The reasons for this ineffectiveness go beyond the too little, too late offer as a standard criticism. The shortcomings of the task force have more to do with its reluctance to fully engage with the scientific community, take advantage of emerging technologies, and raise awareness about the consequences of reef degradation. Subpoint B. The U.S. federal government throws money at monitoring coral reefs but doesn't do much to protect them. This is Jennifer Weeks, 2014. The United States spends a lot of money on monitoring coral reefs but doesn't do much to protect them. Our strategy seems to be watching them wait until they die. To address these attitudinal barriers that exist in restoring coral reefs, we present the following plan. The United States federal government should fund biorock reefs in the Coral Triangle, located around Australia, Indonesia, and Polynesia, and the Caribbean, including the Gulf of Mexico. Such a plan will spend $5 billion. Our plan solves for the harms to coral reefs in Convention 3, solvency. Subpoint A. We are aware that there are plenty of causes the reef collapse. Biorock is our greatest chance of restoring them to life with these threats. This is the World's Resource Review in 2005. Marine ecosystems are being degraded by human activities. Destructive impacts include overfishing, introduction of exotic species and parasites, new emerging diseases, chemicals with negative biological impacts, over-fertilization from nutrients by sewage, fertilizers, and waste, and global warming. The sources of negative impacts are highly diverse, widespread, and closely linked to high population densities and fundamental economic activities. Unless they're all abated simultaneously, there's little possibility for critical marine ecosystems and species to recover naturally. Therefore, global ecosystem restoration strategies are urgently needed. Conventional reef restoration methods fail when water quality deteriorates or temperatures increase. Biorock electrolytic technology uniquely maintains healthy coral and fish populations under high temperatures and reduced water quality that are normally fatal. Low voltage direct electrical current provides energy to grow its skeleton, leaving the coral with growth, reproduction, and resisting environmental stress. Reefs can be restored in locations where they can no longer grow due to global warming and pollution. Biorock methods are the best hope for preserving coral reef ecosystems. Subpoint B. Peer-reviewed science proves that biorock reefs attract fish, survive better than normal reefs, and grow faster than normal coral. This is Thomas Garreau, July 2014, Scientific Research Publishing. Electrolysis methods have been applied with spectacular results. Low voltage direct current trickles increases the settlement of corals 25 times higher than on charge control sites, increases the mean growth rates of reef building corals by 3 times, and increases the survival of electrically charged marine organisms of 3 times greater than controls, with the biggest increase under the most severe environmental stresses. Our plan brings about multiple advantages. The first is food security. Subpoint A. 500 million people are dependent on coral reefs for food. This is the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration in 2011. Coral ecosystems are a source of food for millions. They provide habitat, spawning, and nursery grounds for economically important fish species, and they provide jobs and income to local economies from fishing. Coral reef declines will have alarming consequences for approximately 500 million people who depend on coral reefs for food. Subpoint B. The disappearance of coral reefs leads to poverty and hunger for millions. This is the Christian Science Monitor, Ryan Slockoff, 2010. Coral reefs are the foundation of the ocean food chain. Hundreds of millions of people worldwide, 1 billion across Asia alone, depend on them for food. If the reefs vanish, hunger, poverty, and political instability ensue. Whole nations will be threatened in terms of their existence. If reefs were to disappear, commonly consumed species would become just memories. Other creatures that are vital in many people's diets would also suffer. Commercial fisheries would fail miserably in meeting demands for seafood. Fish would become a luxury good. We will not be able to maintain food security around the world. Ocean fisheries provide direct employment to at least 38 million people worldwide, with an additional 162 million people indirectly involved in the industry, according to the UN. The second advantage is biodiversity. Subpoint A. Coral reefs, especially in the Coral Triangle, are crucial to biodiversity. This is the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration in 2011. In terms of biodiversity, the variety of species living on coral reef is greater than any other shallow water marine ecosystem and is one of the most diverse on the planet. Coral reefs support more than 800 hard coral species and more than 4,000 species of fish. Over 25% of the world's fish biodiversity is associated with coral reefs. The Coral Triangle is recognized as the most biodiverse reef region in the world. It is home to 1/3 of the world's remaining reefs, 75% of known coral species, and almost 3,000 species of fish. Subpoint B. The status quo sees animal mass extinction due to coral reef extinction by 2050. This is Ben Block in 2008. The world is on the brink of a massive extinction event, according to the United Nations. Unlike previous events, however, extinctions are happening over the course of decades rather than centuries. Recent studies suggest that a quarter of the world's species will go extinct by 2050. Many of the remaining reefs disappear within the next 40 years. We effectively lose corals as we know them, with major coral extinctions. The demise of coral reefs affects the entire ocean ecosystem. A quarter of all marine fish species reside in reefs. Subpoint C. Biodiversity is key to medicine, economy, and agriculture. This is MIT 2011. Species help make Earth habitable to humans and contribute to our way of life, providing us food and pharmaceuticals. The United Nations knows that at least 40% of the world's economy and 80% of the needs of the poor derive from biological resources. Although humans consume only a small number of species, these species depend on many others in order to thrive. Additionally, the agricultural process of intercropping and crop rotations increases productivity. This requires a diverse array of species. Biodiversity contributes to agriculture both by increasing productivity and protecting yield. Biodiversity provides much of the basic necessities of food, water, clothing, and shelter. The pharmaceutical and personal care markets, which relied on chemicals extracted from diverse life forms, together raking $652 billion for the U.S. in 2006. In summary, you should vote affirmative today because right now coral reefs are declining in the status quo to a point where there will be mass extinctions of coral reefs, which coral reefs are key to food security in the Coral Triangle and worldwide biodiversity. And biodiversity is critical for economy, agriculture, and medicine. For these reasons alone, you should vote affirmative in today's debate. Now open for cross-examination. Yeah.
You ready? Okay, everyone ready? Alright, so how much does your plan fund?
$5 billion.
Okay, do you have any evidence that indicates that $5 billion is going to be sufficient to give enough reef habitat?
So you're saying that, I guess, yes, we'll have enough money to fund a sufficient habitat.
What does that exactly mean? Like, how many of these bio-rock reefs are you going to be able to construct?
It's not the quantity of the reefs that matters, it's more that just we have this amount of mass in the ocean that will provide for the...
So if any reefs survive, then biodiversity is going to be sustained?
No, we'd have to have a large amount of reefs in order to protect biodiversity.
Didn't you just say, though, it doesn't matter, we just need some mass of it?
The quantity of coral reefs is not important. Coral reefs vary in size, so quantity doesn't really matter. It's more of the quality of the reef.
Okay. Under solvency, your subpoint A current said BioRock Works is from 2005. This is from 7 years ago, or 9 years ago, 10 years ago. Why haven't we done anything yet?
Because the U.S. is ignoring emerging technology right now.
Why?
Why are they ignoring emerging technology? I don't have a reason, but they are.
If it's beneficial, why would they ignore it?
I don't have a reason why.
Okay, that's fine. So let's move on to food security. So in your evidence, does it ever indicate that people specifically rely on fish only from the reefs?
It talks about how they fish from the reefs and they need these reefs for their food.
Okay, can I see that evidence?
Yeah. This is in fishing?
Yes. Okay, that's fine. On biodiversity, you say that marine biodiversity is key to agriculture. How is marine biodiversity key to land agriculture?
Well, the card is specifically talking about, or I guess it's talking about biodiversity in general, however, you can still cross-apply the medicine and economy.
So the agriculture thing doesn't make sense?
Yes.
Okay. So what's the reason why biodiversity allows us to access medicines?
Because we extract medicines from different types of organisms, and so we need a variety of species in order to have the maximum number of medicines and different possibilities for these medicines.
So if we prove there is still a sustainable source of medicine, even if reefs die out, do we win this advantage?
Not the entire advantage, because it's still important to economy.
Okay, that's fine. So let's move back to plan. What's the agent that's doing the plan?
The agent of action is the U.S. Coral Reef Task Force.
Okay, and you're just going into like the Caribbean and these countries, and you're just going to build a bioreactor, right?
Well, in the Caribbean and the Gulf of Mexico, we're specifically only using U.S. waters, and then we have evidence
U.S. waters. Wait, how does the Caribbean have control of waters right outside Caribbean nations?
The U.S. has territories in the Caribbean that we
So
are.
it's yes going to develop those small territories.
Well, I would not say they're small. So yes, the U.S. territories.
All right, that's fine. Yeah, we'll take some prep time. All right, we're ready. How much prep time do we have left?
I have 45 minutes.
All right, so beginning with a few thank yous. First off, I'd like to thank my partner, Tim, for being the reason I got into debate in the first place. He harassed me a lot freshman year about joining debate to be his partner, and I eventually did, and I'm thankful to him for that. Also, I'd like to thank the Chesterton debate team in general for doing a lot of prep to help us get this far. They're really the reason we're here. Specifically, I'd like to thank Coach Lowry for working with me, working with Tim, helping us become better debaters and improve all the time. And then finally, most of all, I'd like to just thank my parents for all the support they've given me in all my activities I've tried to do throughout my life. And then finally, my last thank you goes out to a very special CHS debater that has always been a role model for me, and his style of debate inspired me. Thanks, Zach Bogich. All right, the order is going to be one off, their state of the coral contention, solvency, food security, and then biody. All right, is everybody ready? All right, you can label this the international law disadvantage. Subpoint A, the U.S. strictly adheres to international law now. The Economist, May 23, 2014. Decisions by international courts are complied with in 95% of the cases by the U.S. The U.S. has appeared in more cases than any other state. In all but 2, it has fully complied with rulings. Subpoint B, the plan develops other nations' waters without consultation, which breaks international law. American University, 2006. The United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea became the international legal agreement for marine conservation. Provisions undermine its effectiveness for coral reef living resources do not belong to the common heritage of mankind. Coral reefs are within coastal states' jurisdiction, entitling them to conserve or exploit the reefs as they see fit. While a state may restore marine life, nothing requires them to do so. No state can challenge the policies of its neighbors. Subpoint C is violating international law once causes more violations in the future. Yale University, 2003. A policy of unilateralism seems unsustainable. The U.S. is a global network of treaties. Unilateral decisions to bend one treaty commitment rarely end the matter, but usually trigger vicious cycles of treaty violation. Subpoint D. U.S. compliance to international law is needed to solve global issues. Yale University, 2003. The U.S. cannot ignore its treaty obligations while expecting its treaty partners to help it solve global problems that extend far beyond one nation's control. AIDS, climate, debt, drug smuggling, trade, and trafficking human beings. Treaty breaking creates the impression of a U.S. contemptuous of its treaty partners. That undermines American soft power. That solved terror, Iraq, the Middle East, or North Korea. So under the UN Law of the Sea Treaty, nations cannot interfere with coral under the jurisdiction of other nations. The plan has the U.S. interfere with coral under the jurisdiction of Caribbean nations and nations in the Coral Triangle without consulting those nations on the matter first. Therefore, the plan breaks international law, which makes other countries perceive the U.S. as an untrustworthy partner at solving global problems. The U.S. can no longer cooperate effectively with the world on pressing international issues, which is a major disadvantage of the plan. Now move on to their state of the coral contention. I'll have 5 responses. First off, artificial reef balls already create sufficient fish habitat globally. The Economist, December 6, 2014. Making reefs with concrete has been successful. Reef balls make the most of photosynthesis. This improves the nourishment of creatures within. A hole in the top reduces the chance of them being moved by storm. Concrete used to make a reef ball is mixed with the powder to strengthen the material and lower its acidity. Tiny hollows provide a foothold for coral. 500,000 reef balls have been placed in the waters of 60 countries, and each should last for 500 years. So since reef balls already provide artificial habitat for fish worldwide, the construction of more artificial reefs is unnecessary and is a waste of money. My second response is that the newest studies indicate coral can survive acidification. National Geographic, January 15th, 2015. In 2004, coral samples were put in water where they were fed, weighed, and monitored for recovery. Corals adapt, survive, and grow despite ocean acidification. We're finding resilience in an endangered species. There's hope that this species can continue to grow. My third response is that BioRock is being used globally already. National Institute of Technology, 2010. The Global Coral Reef Alliance uses mineral accretion, or BioRock. Technology has been successfully applied to mariculture. Reefs with BioRock are growing in Maldives, Seychelles, Thailand, Indonesia, Papua New Guinea, Mexico, and Panama. My fourth response is that coral transplants are being done in the Caribbean and in the Gulf right now. From CNN in 2012. Coral Restoration Foundation has grown 25,000 corals in underwater nurseries. Ken's Coral Nursery is the largest in the Caribbean. The corals spend a year in the nursery, they are transplanted to a reef in the wild. We've been able to recreate the biggest thickets in the Florida Keys, and we can duplicate throughout the Caribbean. The impact is already noticeable. Fish are starting to come back. Within the next 5 years, the Coral Restoration Foundation plans to grow and transplant 50,000 corals in the Caribbean. There's hope. And my fifth response is that marine protected areas exist throughout the Coral Triangle. From the World Wildlife Foundation, 2014. WWF created a network of MPAs in the Coral Triangle. MPAs protect reefs. They allow damaged areas to recover. So these MPAs are already solving for reefs in the Coral Triangle because they're protecting them. All right, now onto their solvency. My one argument here is just that they have no evidence that their funding is enough to provide this BioRock in all the places that they claim to solve for. And then also, they don't have any evidence that countries in the Coral Triangle, such as Indonesia, will even cooperate with the U.S. on this. Now going to their food security advantage. A few responses here. First off, the fish that rely on coral reefs aren't important to fisheries. Department of Marine and Wildlife Resources, American Samoa Government, 2012. The death of corals primarily impacts fish that live in the branches of corals. These fish tend to be small and so less important for fisheries. So even if reefs do die, the fish that rely on those reefs are small and not caught by fishers anyway. For this reason, collapse of coral reefs would have a negligible impact on fisheries. My second response is that fishermen intentionally don't catch fish that rely on reefs. Department of Marine and Wildlife Resources, American Samoa Government, 2012. Coral reefs have highly diverse communities with 2,000 fish species. Reef fisheries take about 200 species in the Pacific and 100 in the Caribbean. Fewer than 20 species make up more than 75% of the catch. The fishery is not complex. Fish species that are ecologically extinct will be so rare they will rarely, if ever, appear in the first catch. So fishermen realize that fish which rely on reefs might be prone to extinction. So the fishers instead decide to focus on species that are not reliant on reefs. For this reason, fisheries will continue profiting even if coral reefs do die. Now go on to their biodiversity advantage. One response here, and that's that historically, reef extinctions have not destroyed biodiversity. the American Association for the Advancement of Science 2003. Many species underwent dramatic shifts in response to warming. For corals, range boundaries of coral in the Lake Pleistocene extended 500 kilometers. Species presence in Papua New Guinea changed remarkably little during 9 reef-building intervals. Marine species exhibit a genetic legacy of these shifts, local expansion, and population fluctuations caused by variation. Already, corals and other organisms are changing rapidly in response. So in the past, reefs have gone extinct, but fish have either migrated to distant reefs to continue living, or they adapt genetically to the changing environmental conditions to be able to stay where they are. Either way, reef collapse won't threaten global biodiversity. And you can also cross-apply the arguments about how the coral triangle is doing marine protected areas right now, so that protects biodiversity in the coral triangle because they monitor fishing, have regulations on it, so biodiversity won't be destroyed. And then also you can cross-apply the reef balls and how they're solving biodiversity right now because they're the artificial reefs. And then also in the biodiversity, again, they talk about how biodiversity is key to agriculture, which doesn't really make sense because if they're saving marine biodiversity and that doesn't have any impact on agriculture, which would be on land. So for these reasons and many more, I can only see a negative ballot. Thank you. I'm open for cross-examination.
Is everyone ready? Okay, let's begin. So, in your international law disadvantage, what law are you specifically breaking?
The UN Law of the Sea.
Does the U.S. currently adhere to the UN Law of the Sea?
Well, yes, they're currently adhering because they're not going in other nations and building coral reefs.
Have we ratified Law of the Sea?
Not like exactly, we haven't like supported it, but we have evidence saying that the U.S. like following Law of the Sea is still good for us, and us disobeying it still shows like contempt for other nations.
Okay, but we're not legally bound to following it, is that correct?
Well, the disadvantage isn't based on being legally bound. It doesn't matter whether we're legally bound to doing it or not. The issue is how we look to other countries when we disobey international laws.
Okay, so if we prove that we would cooperate with these countries, you wouldn't have any link for your disadvantage.
I mean, your plan doesn't say anything about cooperation.
Okay, but if we, okay, thank you. Going on to harms, you said BioRock is already being implemented. Do you know the size of these facilities?
It didn't have an exact size, but it said that there's BioRock, and it named a bunch of places all over the world.
Can I see the card, please?
Yeah. Right there. It has a list at the end of the...
Okay, thanks. So how do MPAs currently protect these protect current reefs?
What our card is talking about is how right now marine protected areas are already all throughout the coral triangle, and that they protect reefs. They allow like the damaged areas of the reefs to recover naturally without being like influenced or damaged any longer.
Okay, so wouldn't all causes like global warming and all of this affect reefs, and these MPAs can't protect against that?
Well, as we read earlier in the State of the Coral Contention, the second response here was how like newest studies prove that corals were resistant to acidification. So that showed that like the only thing that would be killing coral would be man-made causes, which these MPAs do protect them from.
How do they protect against pollutants and stuff like that?
Because they monitor it. It talks about how they like protect these areas, they allow them to recover, they try and like, they keep out like pollution, they keep out like fishermen and try and like monitor the...
How do they keep out the pollution?
They like, there's regulations on like where they can pollute in that area. Like they're not gonna let just an industry like to pollute into an area where there's a protected coral reef.
Okay, so when were reef balls last implemented?
I don't know exactly. I think there's some evidence from like a year or two ago about how like the Gulf of Mexico just did the largest. I can bring that up later.
Okay, let's see, so on solvency, you just had pressing for cooperation and pressing for funding, is that it?
Yeah.
Okay, thanks. Okay, so on your food security, you had an argument about how does the collapsed reefs not harm fish?
It didn't say exactly, does it? Like it says that, first off, it's talking about how the fish that rely on coral reefs aren't ones that like fishermen actually go for because these fish are too small to actually be worthwhile catching. And then second, talk about that fishermen intentionally don't catch fish that rely on reefs anyway because they realize how important they are.
Okay, how do the fishermen differentiate between the ones that do and don't rely on reefs?
Well, I mean, they can see what area they're in. Like, they're not, if they fish over a reef, they know that they're probably going for fish that rely on reefs, and they can always throw them back once they catch them if it's like a special species.
Thanks.
The affirmative will take forever. Before I begin, there are a couple thank yous that I have to make. First of all, I have to thank my team. I would not have gotten this far without them. This team has provided like the help and cooperation that I've needed to get this far. I also need to thank my partner Nathan. Obviously, he's a key part of the success of this team, and I wouldn't have been able to make it this far without him. I'd also like to thank my coach, Chris Lowry, for being able to help Nate and I debate well and learn to debate. I also have to thank my opponents, Tim and Joel, because they were the ones who encouraged us to join debate in the first place as sophomores, so we definitely would have been here without them. I also have to thank my parents for repeatedly encouraging me in everything that I do. All right. So as a roadmap, judges, I'll be hitting first the international law disadvantage, and then I'll be hitting case in the order that we first presented it. Okay, is everyone ready? So let's begin. On the international law disadvantage, I'd like to point out that their evidence is all about the UN Law of the Sea Treaty. The United States has not ratified the United States Law of the Sea Treaty, so this disadvantage does not apply to our case. Additionally, their link part is that the plan is developing in countries without their consent. The key clause here is without their consent. I'll be explaining later why the United States will be developing with these countries' consent and why it won't be just unilateral development. In harms, they ran this argument about artificial reef balls, and they said that they were sufficient in the status quo. I'll have three responses. First, since reef balls are so prevalent, the fact that reefs are still in danger reflects the fact that they don't salt. So these reef balls are not sufficient right now. Secondly, reef balls are untested. No one knows how well they work. This is from Jan Spiegel, May 2014. Reef balls, part of a Connecticut project aimed at stemming the rampant erosion. While the project will be watched carefully for potential applications elsewhere, there's one big problem. No one is sure it will actually work. It's experimental. We don't know if it's going to work. I can think about it and I can hypothesize, wouldn't it be great if it did all these things, but we actually don't know. This highlights the fact that reef balls are experimental, and the reason they've been implemented on such a wide scale is because they're so cheap and easy, so governments to just call it an easy fix to coral reef degradation, which is still happening. And thirdly, Biorock solves better than reef balls. This is from Natalie Hang, 2012. Earlier coral reef rehabilitation methods involving reef balls provide a substrate for coral larvae to settle on and start growing. Biorock serves not just as a substrate, but exposes the coral to an enriched environment as the electrical charges attract a concentration of ionic materials which boosts coral growth. The low voltage running through the structure attracting minerals such as calcium and carbonate ions. These are the building blocks of calcium carbonate which corals use to create their cells. Accelerated growth rates have occurred in Biorock installations. So this card is talking about how this area had this card is talking about why Biorock is better than reef balls and how it doesn't violate inherency. The harms are still occurring in the status quo. Additionally, the second point where they said corals can survive acidification, I'd like to point out that this card talked about an experimental trial where they took a small amount of coral, put it in a tank, and had one with acidified water and one without. So this trial was not in the real world. It didn't test how corals actually survive in the real world. And there are all these alternative causes, as my partner mentioned in his 1AC, talking about how there's not only ocean acidification, but also global warming, there's also pollutants, there's also fertilizers, there's all these other factors that are killing coral reefs that don't make them resistant. And they also said that Biorock is being used globally already. I'd like to respond to this by saying that I'll pull this up here. That Biorock has been only developed on a small scale, but they want to increase scale and work with governments. This is Biorock Technologies 2012. All our support has come from local groups, and except for one project in the Turks and Caicos Islands, they have never been funded by any government or large funding agency. Typical small pilot projects are done for a few hundred or thousands of dollars for all the materials and equipment. We plan to stop doing little projects except with community-based groups and focus on large funded projects in the future, but that has not yet happened. So even though there are multiple Biorock projects, the fact is that there's a small pilot test projects not instituted by governments or large organizations, so Biorock is not occurring in a substantial capacity right now. And additionally, they talk about how coral transplants are being done right now. I'd like to point out this card is from 2012. Our evidence about harms is from 2015. So the harms are still persistent, even in areas where the coral transplants are being done. And for the MPA's argument, there are all these global factors that MPAs don't solve for. MPAs just like mitigate fishing in areas. So they can't, MPAs don't solve for ocean acidification, MPAs don't solve for pollution, MPAs don't solve for excessive fertilizers. So this is why harm still stands. When they attacked our funding, they said there was no evidence for funding. I'd like to respond to this by saying that BIROC is cost efficient and cheap. This is from BIROC. This is from Thomas Garone, Robert Trench, 2013. Mineral accretion is able to rely entirely on non-polluting and renewable energy, is suitable for remote areas, and experiments showed that 1.07 kilograms of mineral accretion was precipitated per kilowatt hour of energy. Resulting materials are nearly an order of magnitude cheaper than equivalent weight in concrete blocks. So if you imagine $50 billion being spent on concrete blocks, and you take that mass and apply it to coral reefs, that's how many coral reefs are being produced as part of this plan. So we'll be able to substantially solve this plan. And they said that we had no evidence that countries will cooperate. Well, in the Caribbean, we're just doing it in U.S. waters, so we don't need to cooperate with anyone. But Indonesia and the U.S. regularly cooperate, especially on environmental issues and infrastructure. This is from the U.S. Department of State, 2012. U.S.-Indonesia relations have never been stronger. They have commitment to elevate bilateral relations by intensifying consultations and developing habits of cooperation. And then both countries regularly consult on issues such as disaster relief and climate change. And the U.S.-Indonesia Infrastructure Memorandum of Understanding, signed in August 2012, will support greater bilateral cooperation on infrastructure projects. And through a grant to the U.S. Forest Service, the Department of State is supporting the development of the Indonesian Climate Change Center. So let's talk about how we're cooperating with Indonesia right now, especially on environmental projects and on infrastructure projects, which is what our plan is. There's no reason that we won't be able to cooperate with them. And this is that we'll be able to cooperate with them. This is why we don't link to the international law disadvantage. When they talked about food security, they had two arguments that were very similar. They said coral deaths impact fish that don't get caught for fishing, and that people don't catch fish that rely on the reefs. I will respond to these in essentially the same fashion. Like biodiversity, food webs are complex. So even if these big fish that they catch don't directly rely on coral reefs, the fact that coral reefs are such biodiversity hotspots, these fish eat other fish that live on the reefs. So if reefs were to die, these fish that may not be directly caught for fishing, but the fact is that these other fish will still be implemented because they'll have loss of food source. It's this food chain here. And if you notice, their cards were very selectively cut, indicating their cards were just 1 or 2 sentences saying that fish that are caught, their card didn't give any warrants on why it doesn't happen. So this evidence doesn't really hold up. And on the biodiversity advantage, they discuss how coral doesn't cause mass extinction. We would like to respond to this because we talk about how, in our evidence for biodiversity advantage, how this mass extinction is different. It's happening over the course of decades, not centuries, and it's being caused by humans. So this is not you can't use empirical evidence for this because these mass extinctions are totally different than the ones that have happened in the past. And you can't say, well, corals are really old, they probably survived this. That doesn't hold up. And they attacked our impact by saying that biodiversity was key to, they responded that we don't link to agriculture. Even if you don't believe that we link to agriculture, the economy and part of that biodiversity card still holds up. So this advantage still stands here. In conclusion, I urge an affirmative ballot based on the fact that we'll be able to solve for the harms that are indeed real, and the international law disadvantage is overblown and doesn't apply to our case because we'll be cooperating with countries. Thank you. I'm now for cross-examination.
All right, is everybody ready? All right, so let's begin on your state of the coral contention.
Sure.
You said something about how reef balls are untested. What was the date on that card?
I believe it's 2014. Yes, May 2014.
All right, who was the author there?
Jan Spiegel.
Like, what are her credentials?
She writes for the Connecticut Mirror.
And
she cites a biology professor here. So most of these, the evidence talks about is quotes from a biology professor.
So wait, where's she quoting the Bible?
Right there. It's experimental, said Jennifer Matai, a biology professor who specializes in restoration ecology.
Well, okay, so that you're just, okay. And then So it's just like this, if this biology professor's like opinion, like why would you just, they don't give any reasons like why it might not work or anything.
It's just saying that it's untested right now.
But wouldn't like putting reef balls in the water, like those 500,000, like be the test for it too though?
I would argue that this test has failed based on the fact that coral reefs are still dying as per our 2015 evidence.
Okay, and then, where you said, how do MPAs not solve?
MPAs don't solve because MPAs just mitigate fishing habits. So at best, all MPAs can claim to solve is like destructive overfishing. We argue that there are extensive global factors and pollution factors that still cause coral reef decline, and so MPAs don't solve here.
Because you're saying they only like prevent fishing?
Yeah, at best, they can only prevent fishing.
Okay. And then you talked about how like biorock's cost efficient, but like do you have any evidence like about like the cost or like the cost of like how much biorock?
It'd be totally unreasonable to ask the affirmative team to say, how much money do you need to solve in these exact places? If such evidence existed, that would mean that our plan is not inherent. Of course, it's all hypothetical, because if exact evidence existed, then this plan would already be happening in the status
So
quo.
can you like tell me like how big is like what $5 billion of concrete?
50 billion.
50. How big is that?
Pretty dang big. I don't know.
All right. And then you said something about how it's like just in U.S. waters in the Caribbean. Is that you said something about that, right?
Could you rephrase your question?
Like what are U.S. waters in the Caribbean? Didn't you say like under the?
For example, Puerto Rico, Virgin Islands, those U.S. waters in the Caribbean. That's where we're including.
So you're not doing all of the Caribbean, just like certain places?
Correct.
Okay. And then you brought up evidence about like U.S. and Indonesia cooperate, but was that about like actually on the U.S. like going and building coral reefs, or just that like they talked about it?
Again, the fact that this evidence doesn't exist due to the fact that the plan isn't going to happen. There's no one out there writing like the U.S. and Indonesia regularly cooperate on solving biorock reefs, because they haven't.
But is there no evidence that the U.S. wants to cooperate, or that Indonesia wants to cooperate with the U.S. on those type of things, or just like in the past they've talked
I
about
read that
coral?
evidence. I don't know what else you want.
All right. No further questions.
No prep time needed. So I haven't really thought about this at all. So I'd like to thank my parents for encouraging me to do this. Specifically, I'd like to thank my dad. He's shown up to almost every single debate tournament of my career, so that's pretty helpful. I'd like to thank my whole team. We really, throughout the year, I don't know if we worked necessarily as well as we are, but the past couple of weeks, we really bonded. We worked better than I think I've ever worked with the debate team. So it's been great. I'd like to thank my partner, Joel, for staying with me, though he has band and a lot of other commitments and still working hard. I'd like to thank my opponents, Nate and Fred. We invited them to join debate because they're our friends, and it's cool to actually be in a round like this with them. I'd like to thank my coach, Mr. Lowry. He's really taught me a lot. I wouldn't be anywhere near I am today. And I'd just like to thank all my opponents for making debate competitive, because otherwise I wouldn't be here. So for roadmap, it's going to be the state of the coral contention, solvency, and the biodiversity advantage. If everyone's ready, I will begin. So beginning on the state of the coral advantage, this advantage is a combination of inherency and harms. As long as we prove that either A, something is being done to sufficiently solve the issue of reef habitat loss, or B, reefs aren't dying in the first place, then we win that they lose the stock issue, and therefore we should win this round. So let's first begin with the argument of coral reef balls. To explain, 500,000 coral reef balls exist at 500 sites throughout the ocean. The reef balls are made of a mixture of concrete and microsilicon, a powder with genetic properties that strengthen the concrete. This powder allows the concrete to withstand the effects of acidification and lasts for 500 years. Furthermore, the powder actually prevents the effects of acidification on the reef stock inside the reef balls, so the reefs can grow healthfully too. Since a huge number of reef balls provide a sustainable home for fish around the globe, a plan to protect current coral reefs is not necessary and just a waste of money. Now, my opponents had three responses to this, and their first two responses were very similar, both of them being that A, coral balls don't work, and B, it's untested. Well, I'll have two responses. First, reef balls are colonized by organisms almost instantly. Marinecultures.org, 2015. Reef balls revitalize dead reefs or revive a lifeless seabed. As early as a week after the reef balls are sunk, algae grow. Shortly thereafter, sea snails, worms, and larvae can be observed. Crabs and crawfish seek shelter. Fish use them as hatcheries and corals grow on the surface. And second, fish colonize reef balls almost immediately again. That's from Practical Fish Keeping 2012. Marine life habitat creation has been running for 14 years. Thousands of reefs have been erected worldwide, from the Gulf of Mexico and Caribbean to the Atlantic, Persian Gulf, and the Pacific, which is all the areas they're doing their plan. We see immediate colonization have natural biomass counts after the first year, producing 0.45 metric tons of biomass annually. After 2 years, the system becomes a full-blown reef. Artificial reefs have been installed in Indonesia. This evidence even indicates that we've been doing this for 14 years, so clearly the reef balls have already been tested. Now, their last argument was that biorock is better because it allows the reefs to grow better. I'll have two responses. First, we just provided sufficient evidence saying that it helps reefs to grow because they're resistant to the effect of acidification inside the reef balls. But my second argument is, even if they make the reefs grow better, that's not important because both their advantages are just based on the existence of reefs in general. As long as there's some reefs that exist, biodiversity isn't going to totally collapse, and fisheries won't totally collapse either. Therefore, as long as some reefs still survive inside the coral reef balls, we've proven that the harms have already been solved, and therefore you should not vote affirmative. The second argument that we are going to make on the coral reef flow is the fact that coral reefs can survive acidification, so they won't die. Now, they had two responses to this. Their first response was this was not in the real world. It was a laboratory test, so it should be rejected. I'll have one response, which is this is a very reliable test. It was done by National Geographic, and it quotes a 10-year study starting in 2004 where they kept looking at coral reefs that were in the natural environment and in laboratories, and after doing this 10-year report, they found that acidification had no effects on coral reef growth. Therefore, our sources are very reliable. Their second response was that warming, pollutants, and fertilizers also caused the corals to die. I'll have two responses. First, to respond to warming, reefs recover from bleaching, the effect of warming. Scientific American, January 15, 2015, a new study offers hope. Scientists found that reefs rebound even from severe bleaching events, such as those that whitened 90% of a reef in 1998, the most severe bleaching event on record. The team monitored 21 reefs in Seychelles since 1994. The majority of these reefs were able to recover after bleaching. Reefs have survived bleaching, may be even more resilient to future troubles, as reefs that weathered 1998 proved resilient in 2010. Corals just might be capable of adapting to survive global environmental changes, wrote marine biologist Podolfi. So bleaching is the net effect that warming has on reefs, which causes them to die. However, this study shows that they can survive that. Now, to address the fact that pollutants and fertilizers are used, the impact of pollutants and fertilizers is what acidification is. Pollutants and fertilizers, when they go into the ocean, the reason why they harm marine life is because they increase the acidity levels of the ocean. That's why it kills them. However, since we've shown that the reef balls are resistant to the acidification, we're able to solve for that. And also, even if you buy the argument that perhaps the pollutants or fertilizers inherently have adverse effects for the fish, the fact is that since these reef balls affect the effects from the pollutants from coming in the first place, then that doesn't affect the reef. That doesn't affect the reef balls, so we don't have to worry about that. Now, we also argue that biorock's being used now. My opponents had one response which said that it was only being used on a small scale. I have one response which is that is enough. As my opponent Nathan said in cross-sex, we don't need that many reefs to survive. He said we just need a few of large biomass. So therefore, since biorock is already being constructed in Indonesia and Mexico, even if it's not done on an extensive rate, as per what he said in cross-sex, that should already be sufficient, so we shouldn't throw more funds at this issue. The last argument that we made was that there's already marine protected areas. They were made in the Coral Triangle and in the Gulf of Mexico, which should be sufficient by the WWF. They had one response which is just logical that marine protected areas don't solve. However, I'll have one response, which is our evidence, which quoted the WWF, say that it protected reefs, and when they were harmed, we would go in there and try to recover them. Therefore, even if reefs are already endangered in these areas, they won't be let to go extinct because there's already programs meant to stop that. Now move on to solvency. Under solvency, we argued for evidence that the plan is cheap. They provided evidence, but I'll have one response, which is their evidence was from Giroux. Giroux is the inventor of biorock. He clearly has an incentive to perhaps twist the facts to try to say that it's cheaper so that his product sells more. So unless they can provide evidence not from Giroux, the inventor of biorock, that is cheap, you should not buy their argument that the plan is enough to solve for the issues. Now, their second argument when we asked for evidence of cooperation, he said that we're just doing U.S. waters in the Caribbean. I'll have one response, which is he never defines clearly what that is, and furthermore, the U.S.-controlled territories in the Caribbean are so minuscule compared to all the actual other nations that are in the Caribbean. So their plan doesn't solve for a substantial area where reefs are dying. Next, move on to the biodiversity advantage. On the biodiversity advantage, the main argument I'm going for here is that even if reefs die out, organisms are able to adapt. The evidence that we read indicated that after 9 reef die-outs throughout history, organisms either adapt to the changes so that they can still live in the habitats, or they move to other habitats where reefs still are so that they can survive. They had one response which stated that since the effects are caused by humans, the empirical studies don't apply. I'll have two responses. My first response is there's no reason why empirical studies wouldn't apply. Our evidence cites 9 distinct examples where coral reefs in areas completely died out, but regardless of that, fish were still able to survive. So therefore, if they die now, they're still going to be able to survive in the future. He doesn't give a reason really why you should reject our evidence, which means you should buy it. And my second response is biodiversity is resilient. That's from the College of William and Mary in 1997. Although Earth stands on the brink of extinction, it may not follow that humans will suffer. Elimination of all but a tiny minority does not affect humans. Humans can survive just as well if 99.9% of our fellow creatures went extinct. Species are redundant in ecological functions, that the life support systems of the planet will function perfectly with fewer of them, even if every threatened organism becomes extinct. The number of creatures available to any ecosystem buffers that system against stress. Increasing biodiversity is likely to make little difference. So what this evidence indicates is that even if we lost 99.9% of species, we would still be able to survive off the rest of it. So we don't necessarily have to be too concerned about biodiversity because it's not going to be that serious of an issue. So overall, since they don't gain any of their advantages and they don't solve, you shouldn't waste money on a program that is inefficient and not successful. Beyond that, we already have programs in place to solve the issues occurring in the status quo. So again, you shouldn't waste money on something that's already occurred. For my policymaker, my partner is going to be covering the disadvantage. And since we've severely mitigated case, that means that you should give the disadvantage a lot of weight in the round. And for my policymaker judges, it seems like they've lost harms, inherency, and solvency, which are 3 distinct reasons why you should vote negative in today's round.
Is everyone ready? Okay. Alright.
Scooter.
Okay. First of all, you said that reef balls are resistant to acidification, correct?
Yes.
Didn't you also say that corals can survive acidification?
Yes.
How do these arguments still work?
Our argument is that even if acidification had adverse impacts on organisms, the fact is the reef balls are made with a special powder that repels the effects of acidification, so that inside of the coral reef balls, they won't, even if they were affected, the acidification won't even be able to enter. Like the acidity level will be normal.
Don't we discuss how there are other alternative causes besides ocean acidification?
The only alternative causes you gave were warming, pollutants, and fertilizer, and I respond to all of those. The first one for warming was that bleaching, which is what warming causes to corals. Studies show that that doesn't actually kill them. And then for pollutants and fertilizers, I didn't provide evidence, but I stated, first of all, that the impact of pollutants and fertilizers is acidification. That's how they kill the reefs. So since we've proven that they're resilient to acidification, that doesn't apply. And then we also stated that likely because the reef balls prevent acidification from entering, they would prevent the pollutants from entering as well.
So, didn't you kind of misquote my partner when you said that like any scale at all will solve for the plan?
I don't believe so, because I asked him like, do we need like a substantial number? He said no, all we need is a decent amount of biomass for it to be able to be efficient. That's what he said.
Okay. Are you attacking Goru's credentials here?
Yeah, we're saying that he might be biased in how he says like the technology is cheap because like he probably profits whenever people do biorock since he owns it.
Okay. Isn't Goru a scientist? Wasn't this research peer-reviewed studies?
I don't know exactly if that was, but like the point is he still has an incentive to try to twist things so it sounds like it's cheaper. Beyond that, he doesn't even give like a specific price on biorock. So like he just gives rhetoric about how it's cheap, but he doesn't nail down a specific price.
Did he mention that local projects can cost hundreds or thousands of dollars?
I don't remember hearing that. Even if it's local, that doesn't sound like the affirmative plan. Like,
well, isn't the point it's just that like biorock is cost efficient and that like he mentioned that order of magnitude argument with concrete? Isn't that the point?
No, I guess we need to see evidence that says biorock that is substantial enough to solve for biodiversity and fisheries can be provided with the money your plan gives.
In the last card you read against our biodiversity advantage, didn't that concede that oceans are already on the brink?
Yeah, but that evidence is from 1997.
So you're discounting your own evidence?
No, we're saying that the fact that if we were on the brink in 1997 doesn't mean we were before. However, this evidence gives studies and it states that even if we did lose all those species, we'd still be able to survive off those 0.1% that are left, just because that's how the...
Our card isn't about our evidence isn't about extinction. Isn't this just discussing ecological collapse is resistant, not the same thing? But habitat collapse is resistant, not biodiversity?
Well, let's look at the impacts. The impacts are medicine, economy, and agriculture. Sure. This states that humans will still be able to prosper even if 99.9%.
All right, no Alright, so in my speech, I'll be covering the international law disadvantage and then go on to the food advantage. Alright, is everybody ready? Alright, so beginning on the international law disadvantage with an overview. The U.S. right now follows international law, but their plan changes that. This is because under international law, coral reefs are under the jurisdiction of the countries that are near the reefs. In this case, the reefs the plan operates on are under the jurisdiction of the Coral Triangle nations and the Caribbean. The plan has the U.S. unilaterally act on these reefs under these nations' jurisdiction without asking the nations if it's okay to act in their waters. This violation of international law leads to more violations, and when the U.S. doesn't abide by global laws, countries don't trust the U.S. to cooperate on international problems. Therefore, as a result of the plan, other nations would be less willing to cooperate on issues such as terrorism, nuclear proliferation, disease, Middle Eastern instability, human trafficking, and trade. These issues require international cooperation to resolve, but the plan precludes any effective cooperation. So although this disadvantage may seem unlikely, but before you sign the ballot, I'd like you to ask yourself, is it worth protecting reefs more if there's a risk other nations refuse to cooperate with the U.S. on pressing international issues as a result? The fact that we've proven coral reefs aren't at risk of collapse means the answer to this question is probably no, so you should vote negative. Now I'll go on to address specific arguments my opponents made on here. First off, my opponents argue that the U.S. is not technically under the Law of the Sea Treaty. I'll have one response, and that's that following the Law of the Sea Treaty still improves U.S. power. Susan Simpson, George Washington University Law School, 2012. Secretaries of State claim as the world's preeminent maritime power, the U.S. has more than any country to lose based on how the convention's terms are applied. So since the U.S. is the world's preeminent maritime power, even if we aren't legally bound to follow the law of the sea, it still negatively affects how other nations perceive the U.S. and precludes cooperation on pressing global issues because they see the U.S. intentionally not only refusing to sign this important treaty, but then intentionally violating the treaty later. My opponents also argue that since they cooperate with these nations, that solves it and they're actually violating the law. I'll have one response, and that's that the plan acts unilaterally. Even if reefs do benefit the nation, the plan still violates international laws because the U.S. constructs these, because the U.S. Does BioRock without asking the nation if we can. Nothing in their plan says that they ask these countries, and they agreed with that in Clause 6. So that would be like China sending architects to America and constructing buildings in Chicago without asking us if they can. Clearly that would spark a negative reaction from America, and in the same way, the plan violates international law, and that would spark a negative reaction with the rest of the world. Now go on to their food advantage. First off, cross-apply the argument about marine protected areas because these are over the reefs and around in the reef areas that are at risk, and fishermen can't fish these areas anyway. So the affirmative team restoring these reefs really has no effect on fishing anyway, since these areas aren't fished in the first place. There's also another reason that these reefs aren't fished. First, extend like the two arguments from the Wen and Sea about how the fish in these reefs are too small, fishermen don't want them anyway, and then about how fishermen intentionally don't catch fish that are reliant on reefs because they know it's bad for the environment. Then my opponents respond to these. They argue that these big fish that fishermen do catch would still be reliant on reefs, on the smaller fish from the reefs for food. But I'll just one response, and that's that it doesn't make any sense because these bigger fish wouldn't just travel out of like the open ocean to reefs just to try and find food. They're going to eat something that's close to them. They're going to find fish that are over there. They're not going to travel over to reefs just to try and like eat every single day. They're just going to find food in their area. Also, my opponents tried saying that our cards were too short. Well, a couple things. Like, first off, only one of the cards was like just a couple sentences. But anyway, like both of the cards still provided like a sufficient explanation as to why they are true. The first was talking about how that reef fish are too small and that fishermen don't want to catch those because they're not profitable at all. And then the second card was talking about fishermen intentionally don't catch it because how it hurts reefs. Both these cards provide sufficient warrants to explain what they mean, so it doesn't matter whether they're short or not. They still give a good explanation. So since these attacks severely mitigate this advantage, and with the lack of arguments on this flow and their responses, and the lack of arguments on the disadvantage responses there, they didn't provide evidence on any of them. Prefer the negative team on these because we all provided evidence, we provided empirical examples, we provided stats and studies, and the affirmative team just came back and tried to make some arguments based on these, but we're still the only team with evidence on these flows, so prefer that. So since this is severely mitigated and this advantage easily outweighs and is a lot more, and it happens a lot sooner, this should make this round an obvious neg ballot. Thank you.
Okay, so for the order, I'm going to start off with the international law disadvantage, and I'm just going to go straight down the flow and address each of their attacks, and then I'm going to say why you should vote app and later on. Okay, without further ado, let's begin. Okay, so basically they had two major attacks on to our attacks on the international law disadvantage. They're saying that following law still helps U.S. power. However, right now we have not ratified the UN or the law of the sea for good reasons, and basically this law is not important to the U.S. And then also, most importantly, their attack, they're saying we're only doing unilateral action is not true. We're cooperating with these countries. These countries want to cooperate with us. They have an incentive to solve for the harms in the status quo because right now their reefs are disappearing. They're going to want to save their reefs. They're not going to sit there idly doing nothing. They're going to want U.S. help and funding. And then again, our impacts of poverty, hunger, and then economy and medicine are much more outweigh their impacts in this international law disadvantage of terrorism and their nuclear proliferation stuff because they never provide evidence that the status quo right now can solve for these impacts. They just say that international law is important to these impacts. They never say that we actually can solve these impacts right now. So then, going on to address their harms, they claim that reef balls are resistant to acidification. However, this contradicts their other evidence saying that right now that corals are resistant to acidification. They're saying that both natural coral and reef balls are resistant. Why do reef balls need to be resistant if natural corals are? And then also they said that reef balls have been used for 14 years. Our cards from 2015 indicate that coral reefs are still declining in the status quo of both the Caribbean and the Coral Triangle. So these reef balls have obviously failed. And then the reef balls are only resistant to acidification. They don't address other alternative causes, which I will read now. This is from our 1AC evidence. Marine ecosystems are being degraded by human activities. Destructive impacts include overfishing, introduction of exotic species and parasites, new emerging diseases, chemicals with negative biological impacts, overfertilization by nutrients from sewage, fertilizers, and waste, and global warming. All of these factors are affecting reefs. Reef balls are only resistant to acidification. And then going on to further address their attack on how reefs recover from warming. It is a slow recovery. It does not recover fast. And these reefs are still dead while they are recovering, so we'll still see the harms in the status quo. And also, the card specifically mentions local environmental changes. However, there's global environmental changes that affect reefs as well. So these environmental changes will cause the degradation in reefs. Going on to address their solvency attacks, they claim that our author is biased because he is the founder of coral reefs. However, that is not true. He did not found coral reefs. He began working with BioRock. Later on in the process, he was not the inventor. And then also, he's a scientist. He has provided scientific data. He is not biased with the scientific data, and the scientific data is peer-reviewed. And also, it's just talking about the cost. He provides specific information about the cost, so he can't be biased on it. And then they also said that the Caribbean is we're not addressing enough areas in the Caribbean right now to solve. However, there's multiple U.S. territories in the Caribbean, and we will be implementing reefs in these areas so we can solve in the Caribbean. However, it's also important they were addressing the Coral Triangle because that is where a majority of the reefs and biodiversity lie. Going on to food security, they basically say that they flowed through their responses basically saying that we're not currently fishing these fish that are from reefs. However, they're ignoring the global food chain. Our biodiversity evidence indicates that fish and all types of species are dependent on each other. So these larger fish have to eat smaller fish, and they are going to be relying on coral reefs. A majority of fish species also are in coral reefs right now. So even if you buy their attacks that we don't fish here, still fish species are dying. It still severely impact the ecosystem. And then they also are talking about how MPs are increasing in the status quo, and that will solve that. It's also true in the plan. MPAs in the status quo and the plan are equal, so don't weigh this in the round. Finally, to address biodiversity, they said there's no reason why their extinction evidence wouldn't apply. However, it doesn't apply because no extinction has been caused by humans before. No extinction has been caused by the laundry list of alternative causes that I have given, which are all human caused. No extinction has been caused by these. And also, our 1AC evidence indicated that the extinctions are occurring over decades rather than centuries. No other extinction has occurred over decades before. This is why that the biodiversity will be harmed in the status quo. Basically, you should vote affirmative right now because their disadvantage is weak and our impacts outweigh.
What's our prep time at?
4:20.
So for a brief roadmap, I'm just going to be addressing the disadvantage, and then I will be moving on to the state of the coral reefs contention. I'll be waiting around for that. So if everyone's ready, let's begin. Our argument on the international law disadvantage is the affirmative team is unilaterally going into coastal regions, specifically the reefs, controlled by Caribbean nations and specifically by countries in the Coral Triangle, such as Indonesia and the Philippines. And they're saying we are going to build this biorock there without talking to them. When that happens, that upsets other nations because international law prevents such unilateral action. So therefore, what happens is other nations are upset at us and are afraid to cooperate with us in multilateral institutions to stop issues such as AIDS, climate change, debt, drug, trade, human trafficking, terrorism, and rogue states. And all these issues can only be solved if we do global cooperation. However, the affirmative team, the plan precludes that. Now, they had three main arguments in the last speech. The first argument is we haven't ratified the law of the sea for a good reason. I'll have two responses. First of all, my opponents didn't even give a reason why we shouldn't ratify the law of the sea, so this shouldn't apply, he just asserted it. And second of all, even if we shouldn't necessarily ratify the law of the sea, my opponent read evidence from George Washington University Law School which indicated that even if we don't sign law of the sea, countries will still become upset at us if we don't follow it. That's because it's largely considered to be the international law for ocean conservation, so therefore since they break that, it would still upset other nations and make them distrust us. Now their second argument was these other nations want to cooperate with us, so they don't link. I'll have three responses. My first response is it's not in their plan text that they're going to cooperate with these other nations. So even if these other nations want to work with us, the fact is their plan is unilateral, not cooperate. Second of all, in cross-examination, Joel asked Freddie if the plan was going to consult these nations on whether or not we should do it, and Freddie answered no, they do not consult. So therefore, they are just going to these coral reefs and doing it on their own without the other nations. And third, even if these other countries want to cooperate, it would still break international law by not talking to them on the issue before they do such a thing. Their last argument was international cooperation doesn't necessarily solve for all the impacts we stated. I'll have one response, which is we read evidence on this issue from Yale University that indicated global cooperation through international law was capable to solve all these large issues. Now, I'd like to point out and focus on this disadvantage that we're the only ones reading evidence on this issue, so you should certainly lean to the negative side on this. Furthermore, as long as we prove on the state of the coral reef flow that already reefs are being addressed, they should give the disadvantage high weight above the affirmative plan. Which leads us to the state of the coral reefs flow. The major argument that's been on the state of the coral reefs flow is the argument about reef balls. Now, to explain again, reef balls are concrete balls that coral reefs grow inside of, and because of the material it's made out of, the effects of acidification don't go inside of them. They've been placed at 500,000, there's been 500,000 reef balls placed at 500 sites in 59 different countries, including in Mexico, in Indonesia, and on the Caribbean, which is where their plan is occurring. Now, they made a few arguments. Their first argument was we contradicted ourselves. They argued that since we said reef balls survive acidification, but acidification is not bad, therefore we contradicted. I'll have one response, which is we didn't contradict. Just because we said that pH levels are low inside the reef balls doesn't inherently mean that we were saying that reef balls harm the reefs in the first place. We were just saying the scientific fact of how reef balls operate. Now, their second argument was that diseases, warming, and pollution all cause destruction of reefs, which reef balls don't solve for. I'll have three responses. My first response is I already responded to one. I read evidence that indicated that bleaching, because of studies, which is what's caused by warming, actually doesn't kill the reefs, so they can survive that. My second response is I also made the argument that pollution can't enter the reef balls, so the effects of pollution are negligible also. And my third response, they just brought up disease in the last speech, so I should be able to read evidence regarding the issue. Reefs are resilient to diseases. That's Sun Centennial, Florida newspaper, 2015. A surprise along the Florida coast revealed dense thickets of coral thought to be disappearing. More than 38 acres of staghorn coral have been found in what scientists call good news for species that sustain several declines due to disease. This is a huge win. Staghorn is the most important coral. So coral can't survive diseases. So for all of these reasons, reef balls are sufficient. They're already providing a habitat for fish, which means we shouldn't throw more money at this issue. Now, on the issue of warming, on whether or not it's legitimate evidence, they had two responses. First of all, they said that our evidence talked about long term, so it doesn't apply. I have one response. Our evidence isolated specific examples in 1998 and 2010, where acidification was high and reefs were expected to die out. However, because of that, or when warming was high and reefs were expected to die out. However, they were able to survive, which shows that reefs are indeed resilient. They also said that we don't do global changes, so therefore it's not, they also argue that reef balls aren't global, so they wouldn't be able to solve. I have one response, which is they don't solve globally either. Their plan only implements reefs or biorock in the Caribbean and in the Coral Triangle, so they can cross-apply this argument to themselves as well. Now, for all my judges, as the policymakers, the impact is enormous, and even if it's low probability, it definitely outweighs the advantages of the case. And as for my stock issues, Judge, I've clearly shown that there's not a harm in the status quo, and we're efficient right now. You should not waste money on a situation that's already being solved. For those reasons, you should vote negative in today's debate.
I believe we have 35 seconds left. Please. Okay. So as a brief roadmap, I'm going to essentially weigh the round, and during this weighing of the round, I'm going to refer to specific arguments on the floor. Is everyone ready here? Okay. Our opponents only went for the disadvantages in the inherency harms argument. My partner made numerous responses against their against the food security advantage and the biodiversity advantage and solvency in his 1AR that they did not respond to at any capacity in the 2NR. Due for this reason, our assertions, those issues should flow affirmative. We will be able to solve for food security in these regions, and we'll be able to solve for biodiversity. And in addition, our plan is able to solve. The only question that remains is the DA and the harms and inherency, which I'll get to right now. First of all, the entire disadvantage is based on the assumption that our plan is unilaterally implementing the plan. We've been saying since the first cross-ex that we'll be able to cooperate with these countries, and up until now they've totally ignored this response and just talked about ignored the response that we're not unilaterally implementing the plan. We'll be able to cooperate with these countries. So for this region, we don't link to the disadvantage. And they discussed their uniqueness evidence indicates that global cooperation is high now, especially on international law. Why then has the status quo not solved for all these advantages that they mentioned? They mentioned climate change, they mentioned human trafficking, they mentioned drug smuggling. If cooperation is high now, why isn't the status quo solving for all these things? This disadvantage doesn't make any sense. And even if you do believe this disadvantage, our advantages still outweigh. Remember, these advantages go totally conceded by the negative team. I believe that hundreds of millions of people suffering from poverty and suffering from hunger outweighs the potential for U.S. and other countries possibly solving for climate change, possibly solving for terrorism. The big thing is possible here, in that even if you buy their DA, which you shouldn't, our advantages still outweigh. So if you're looking from this from a policymaker perspective, this goes F. In the harms argument in the 2NR, he went for reef balls, essentially. He went for reef balls. The fact is, in talking about how many reef balls there are, I believe he said 500,000 reef balls. And reef balls have been happening for 14 years. Why haven't these reef balls solved already? The fact is, these reef balls, our evidence from the 1AC indicated that coral reefs, especially in the Coral Triangle and Caribbean, are still suffering, despite the fact that reef balls have been in place for 14 years. This indicates that reef balls aren't effective and aren't solving right now. They tried to respond to our disease all cause by saying that, we brought it up in the last speech. We read that in the 1AC and they didn't respond to it till now. So you shouldn't believe the argument that we waited until the rebuttals to bring this up. And furthermore, they just argued that reefs are resistant to this, but that doesn't change the fact that reef balls do not solve, and that biorock solves better than reef balls, which is why there's still an inherent barrier to our plan. Our harms are not being solved for in the status quo. And the other two responses they made on here in the 2-1R was that coral reefs are resistant. Again, the fact that these are dying as per our extremely recent evidence indicates that coral reefs are not resistant. And even if reefs are able to survive in small capacities, the fact that so many people are reliant on them, any transitionary period when reefs bounce back is still going to harm poverty and hunger and still trigger the first advantage. So this still flows affirmative. And they argued against solvency by saying that the plan isn't global. We don't need to be global to solve for the harms. The harms discussed were that coral reefs are shrinking in the Coral Triangle and in the Caribbean. So we don't need to implement it globally for global solvency. In conclusion, I urge my 3 stock issue judges to vote F based on the fact that they totally dropped solvency in the 2-1R and that harms and inherency still stand due to the fact that reefs are not resilient and that reef balls aren't solving for the harms. And I urge my policymaker judge to vote on the fact that their DA is extremely unlikely, doesn't link to our plan, that they totally dropped the 2 advantages in the 2-1R, and so they just go conceded. And even if the disadvantage did apply, it would our advantages still outweigh the disadvantage. And to my last judge, I urge you to vote F based on the fact that we're implementing a solution to a problem. Currently, the status quo is not doing anything to stop the problem, is ineffective at solving the problems with coral reefs. We offer a solution to all these alternative causes that are killing coral reefs. And so that's why I urge an affirmative ballot in today's debate. Thank you.